Welcome to A Moment of Bach, where we take our favorite moments from the composer's vast musical output, just a minute's worth or even a few seconds, and show you why we think they are remarkable. We are your hosts, Alex and Christian Giebert. Today's moment is the beginning of the second movement of the Violin Concerto in A minor, BWV 1041. Sometimes it's the job of a piece of instrumental music to just start off and go right away on a journey. That's usually the case with the fast pieces of music and movements. In this podcast, we talk a lot about different movements. We never actually explained this word, Alex, for people who don't know what that is. Yeah. But it just means the different parts of each piece of music, each larger work of music that typically have breaks between them. So like something has three movements. There might be a fast one at the beginning, so there's basically a short, fast piece of music. It ends, the orchestra stops, gets ready, turns their page or whatever. Then they start a second one. Usually that one's slow. Then the third one's usually even faster and more conclusive and a little bit more fireworks at the end. I think that Bach was especially good at openings to slow music. He's got all these famous things that follow that genre. And this one is no exception. Bach is a big fan of the musical device called pedal point. We know from this time period of music the bass line is very important. We talked about how it's called the continuo bass, the basso continuo, and it tends to drive the harmony from the bottom, right? It's what we now call chords, sort of harkens from this era of notes being put together and then a bass line being put on them and then a really firm foundation being used, and that's what that bass is. Yeah. I think Bach was especially good at slow movements that begin with a very steady, unchanging bass line. And we call that pedal point, when a line like a bass part stays on the same note for a while other things happen around it and change harmonies around it. If you follow the bass line at the beginning of this movement, of this violin concerto, and we're talking about before the violin soloist even appears, right? Nothing has happened yet with the violin soloist. He's just waiting. The orchestra is beginning. What's happening is we hear these heartbeat pulses. Bum, bum, almost like the first one of each pair is accented, right, Alex? Yeah. You say that? Especially the first one in each measure. If you take out the score to this, it's kind of interesting. Those notes are eighth notes. Those notes seem like they should be faster, but sometimes in the slow music, he decides to use notes that look like they're going to be faster, but they're not. So you wind up with 30-second notes in this bass line. But that hardly matters. What matters is what it ends up sounding like. And I think this performance, they do a really good job of making a heartbeat out of it. Like bum, bum, strong, weak, which is a really nice way to accent musical meter. Yeah, we call those pulse accents, or sometimes we call them agogic accents, when it's like you're taking an important beat and bringing it out by playing it louder. And a lot of modern music will tell you what notes to accent. There'll be a little specific marking sitting on top of the note on the page saying, accent me, right? But in this old music, that's typically never happening. I mean, it's almost never happening in this music. And you're just expected to know how to do that. And a lot of that is pulse accents, right? A lot of that is making sure that it goes 1 and 2 and, as opposed to like 1 and 2 and if they all sound the same. It doesn't really have that
heartbeat, like you're talking about, Christian. It doesn't really have that slow pulse. If you were to not accent any of those notes, what would happen is they would all sound the same, so the pulse would sound twice as fast, right?
Right, there'd be like half as much actual musical information present, right? Because there'd be no distinction between notes.
So much of the simplicity of what the thing looks like on the page for music of this era is kind of amazing because it gets realized by the players into something so much more. They put these pulse accents on here. They put some ornamentation onto it. They add the harpsichordist and or organist takes the continuo line and adds chords above it. They just make it so much more than what it even started as. But Bach, of course, as the composer, was anticipating that people would be doing that too.
Right. In this example, this pedal point kind of doesn't need to be there, right? You could take it out and it could have a bass line that jumps around with all these chords. These bass notes could easily be jumping around to make these chords make a little more sense, but that's not what he chooses to do. He chooses to have this heartbeat pulsing thing that stays on that note C for a really long time. The reason why I chose this as my moment, or one of my 2 moments for today, because actually I have 2 moments from this introduction. It all occurs within 3 measures, or I guess 5, however you slice it. But my first moment for the day is 2 measures long, and basically 8 chords long. The reason why I love this so much is it's not just a good example of pedal point. It definitely is, but we've seen those before. We talked about the wonderful pastoral opening to the cantata Du Hirte Israel, Höre. And that evoked almost like a bagpipe sort of folksy quality with its bottom note that was so stable and sturdy. This one's a little different because it has a little bit of an extra dimension to it. The bass line does move, right? It keeps popping up, but then it keeps going down.
Yeah.
Starting on like do, 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 mi, fa, sol, do, like that. Da, 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 dum, bum, bum, da, 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 bum.
Yeah, it's like it keeps wanting to escape upwards, but then it falls back down to where it started.
Right. I love how it's just about to get away, but then it has to go back, almost like being back on the ground or something. Like the way I like to think of this metaphorically is like being on a bicycle and going over a little tiny bump that seems like it's going to launch you, but then you just kind of roll back down gently. Like maybe a mountain bike where you're on a trail and there's a dirt hump and you have to go over it, and it always feels like it's going to be this big huge thing, but then it just sinks back down.
Yeah, or like a rubber band stretching a little bit and going back to where it's to a stasis.
Mm-hmm.
Or like maybe this doesn't really work timing wise with the example, but like somebody's shooting hoops or whatever, and it's like there's that little hop up, that little shot, but then it makes it in the basket, and then you're good. You're good. Then we wait a little bit. Then they get the ball again, then they shoot it, and then it's like, oh, good, he made it. You know?
Yeah.
Those kind of things. I mean, there's tons of little metaphors you could make with this, but it's one reason why music is so great, especially abstract music like this. You can kind of just like paint your own little picture of what this could be about, or it could just not be about any of those things, and it still has merit.
If you keep listening and you wait for the bass, it finally does move and it starts to step down, right? That stable pedal point on C finally starts to step down and down to G so that we can begin, our violinist can enter and everything like that. So in a way, like with the bike analogy, to me it's like the first 2 bars is like a couple of humps to go over, but you're still going flat mostly. Da 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 bum, flat. Da 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 bum, bigger and bigger humps. Da 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 bum, but you're still flat. But then finally, you start going down. Ba da da B, da 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 A, ba da da G. Right, and you're finally going down. And that's like finally starting a descent on a trail or something. Also, shout out to my favorite chord in the first measure that, of course, in classical rules, resolves correctly like it's supposed to, but momentarily is very modern sounding, sort of open sounding, made up of fourths.
Yeah, you don't have chords in the Baroque era, functional chords, that are made of just fourths. They have to be made of thirds, at least in some way. But then here it is. So how do you explain that? Well, like you said, like you alluded to, Christian, it's because it's a suspension. It needs to resolve, and then it does. On the fourth chord that you hear, it resolves.
Yeah, and there are other momentary dissonances that seem extra biting that are really just explained by the pedal point. Like there's this chord we hear in the second measure that's like this on beat 2. But that sort of makes its own sense without the pedal point, right? If you imagine it without it. So the pedal point being there before it and after it, sort of being omnipresent in time, makes it legal, right?
Yeah.
The reason why I chose this, again, not just because it's a pedal point, but it's because the bass line leaps up so interestingly, when Bach could have easily chosen a lazier and faster route. The first one seems pretty normal. The second one, also pretty okay. But the third one that happens, bum, 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 ba, right there, that's a very interesting leap of a dissonant interval called the major seventh. Then it has to go up because it's been doing that, but then it has to go all the way back down in an even stranger and bigger leap down.
Yeah.
A steeper drop, bumping down to the ground there. Da 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 bum. This is all a little weird because it normally a melodic figure like that would just resolve itself nearer to where it is. It could go like da 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 da. But this one, it goes ba da da ba. The octave is wrong. It goes down, but it's going down because it's going back down to where it was. Right? It's going down to the floor.
Yeah,
to the ground. And then as it continues, you start to step down. It becomes a sequential stepping down, and you get a lot of the interval of the seventh from that upper note to the lower note.
Yeah, and what I love about this too is that bass line is the melody thing happening right now. I mean, like you said before, this is the intro. This is before the violin soloist even comes in with like the main melodic material. But for now, those other violins and viola are not really playing much of a melody.
No, it's kind of like just chords, upper chords,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you could argue that bum 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 bum. It sounds like a melody, but we know actually that Bach wasn't thinking of that because later it's different.
Yeah.
Later he repeats this kind of pattern and just keeps voicing chords differently above a bass line that sounds like this one.
Yeah, but everything will always still work and sound melodic. That's true of any like fugue. That's true of all this stuff. That's everything horizontally works. That means like in a melodic way, right? As you're reading it across, as you're listening to it. That's what we mean when we say horizontal. And to your point about tempo earlier, Christian, I thought of this too, and I had a composition teacher who told me this. He said like Bach works at every tempo. Yes, he specified this particular movement to be slow, and the one before it to be faster, but you can play Bach at any tempo and it works. That's pretty true of almost everything in Bach. It's just like one of those things that everything is so airtight the way it's composed. Like what you just did there, Christian, when you hummed those violin notes, those short notes that aren't really melodic. If you were to play those a little faster and even remove the rests and just play this twice as fast or something and then just omit the bass line even, it would still sound awesome. Like, yeah, it's just one of those things that you can always transform things like this. You can always play them faster or slower, and it totally works.
Yeah, it's sort of like the music itself is already decoration upon decoration, and you can really get a lot out of it in a lot of different ways. That's why there's so many different recordings and performances of this kind of music, you know. Plus, this is before the metronome was invented, really. I mean, Beethoven had metronomes, I think, early ones, and it really affected him a lot. But in Bach's time, you know, they didn't have as much technology like that. So he probably did have to expect that people were going to perform music at some different speeds. Even though this does have a marking, it says Andante, which means walking speed. So there was probably a relative...
Is that the eighth note, or is it the quarter note? Because it sounds like with this recording and a lot of ones that I've heard of this is like, it's the eighth note, right? It's that bum, bum, bum. I mean, isn't that kind of like...
Right. Actually, it must be the eighth note.
Or is it a slow plod, maybe?
Yeah, it's just
maybe it's a slow walk. Because that's the thing about walking speed. It leaves a lot of room for interpretation. But that's kind of how Baroque music is, right? It's open for interpretation in a lot of ways.
Right. And also it just comes down to like what sounds possible in the extremes of tempo. Like if you decided the quarter note was like that, then
the next violin thing when they come in would be too fast, probably.
It would be totally. And also you got to think that like there are actually 30-second notes in this introduction in the bass line. So just by looking at it, you'd know as a performer this is slow music. Because you got to think of 30-second notes being the smallest division of something you're thinking of. Bum, 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 bum. Even though they don't play it as strictly as I just said.
Yeah, they actually play what sounds like 64th notes in a sort of stylistic choice, which is really cool and probably very well informed. You know, so I think those kind of decisions are always part of what makes it unique. What makes each recording of these kind of things unique.
Yeah, there's so much to listen for. Like Alex, now we're talking about interpretation, and of course in Baroque music that's definitely true. You don't always just play what's on the page. Listen to this bass line again and think it's actually written like this: bum 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 da 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 dum. That's the rhythm.
Yeah, and they are marked as short notes, or at least in this edition, but that might just be an edition thing. And then those little high those bumps that you talked about are written as slurred or like together smooth notes. And so it should be bum, 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 ba, bum, bum. If those were really super smooth. And they don't do that in this recording. And they pick a really more interesting, I think, better way, like we said, of pulsing. And then the way that they spread out those 30-second notes on the edge of that. And it's definitely...
They do something that is very much in line with the Baroque ideal. They ornament it to make it much more decorated, right?
Yeah.
They do what we spoke about all the way back in episode 2, how in the cantata Nun kommt der Heiden Heiland, we saw at the very beginning, that opening. It had a regal opening, almost like for a king marching in, right? And there was a theme to that. They took a figure that could have been bum, 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 ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. So they make that shorter note even later, right?
Yeah.
And even smaller. And they stretch the longer one a little bit. And nothing is lost time-wise. It's just moved around, right?
Yeah.
So things are stretched and pushed and pulled, to make a long story short. That's a lot of the magic of a really good early music ensemble, I think.
Yeah.
Or any musical ensemble, for that matter. It's not something we always have access to in our modern music with a drum set, because that brings a different dimension, but it also closes the door on some of this pushing and pulling of time.
Right.
Because that person becomes the timekeeper. But it's interesting still how many choices a group like the Netherlands Bach Society would have to work with. So I promised another moment, and it happens right as soon as the violin enters. You'll notice a really fun, crunchy dissonance here. The violin starts up on that G and then quickly cascades down. It briefly touches a B natural before it goes back up to a C. Right when it hits that C, right after the B natural, the harmony of another part plays a B flat. This creates a very striking type of dissonance that we call a cross relation, and it means that right after or before a note was another note of the same type, but flat or sharp or natural, depending on how the music is written.
And it has to do with where those notes would lead. You'd expect that B flat to lead down to the A, and on the next measure, finally, it does in the second violin part.
And it always does. The B natural in the solo violinist always goes up to C.
It's
B flat,
raised,
and the harmony
right?
goes down to A.
Exactly, because it's lowered. Yeah, the stuff that's lowered wants to fall. The stuff that's raised wants to go up to the note above it.
It is a concept from hundreds of years earlier than Bach's time, but definitely still by his time was still a pretty intense flavor spice to use. And especially the ones like this that are so biting. There are even ones in other examples of Baroque music and early music with simultaneous cross relations. But this one is a consecutive one. We have a B natural and then a B flat right away in another part. We have a B natural again in the violin part, and then the B flat in the violin part. It happens right after on the next measure. But it always abides by the rules of which way, like you said, Alex, which way the notes go.
Yeah. We even had one just last week, which I didn't really touch on since, Christian, I knew you'd really explain it more this week, in Erbarmerdich, right? We had that in the violin part.
And that one's a simultaneous cross relation.
Yeah, and if you play them and then you pause on it for a second, it sounds horrible. Like, not bad, but just horrible. Not just bad, but horrible.
It'd be like, there is a wrong note.
Yeah, but it does not sound like that in context, right?
No. Yeah, everything is following the rules, and because the rules are strict, you can really stretch an emotional moment like this, or sneak in a simultaneous cross relation like this. And it works, and it's for effect. I mean, you don't do this in a happy-go-lucky theme. You do this in the St. Matthew Passion, right?
Yeah.
Or in a very gripping moment of a violin concerto like this one.
Yeah, and even in that St. Matthew Passion example, of course, the rules were followed. The note that was raised went up in the violin part. The note that was lowered went down in the continuo part.
Mm-hmm.
A nice little thing about this section too, this second moment you chose, Christian, is when it happens, it's not just like, oh, cool, the violin came in, but nothing else changed, because something else does change, and that is that the continuo stopped right then.
Right, it goes away.
Boom, it's gone. And then you do hear like kind of a higher octave playing those pulses now, and that's the viola, which is the, medium range instrument, which previously was just contributing to those short chords happening,
Mm-hmm.
and now it gets to play those pulses, and then the continuo goes away. It's just a nice effect there, and then Bach will bring that back in 2 measures. And go back to the previous thing with no solo, and then he keeps switching off. It's really nice. Another thing that's great about this too is just the solo violin part. I mean, it's got so much rhythmic interest. You talked about that measure, Christian, with the first measure, and how it has that falling motif. But then it has this really lovely thing where it just leaps up. Thing is, it's so cool. It's just rhythmically, it's got a lot going on.
Yeah, it's very virtuosic. It would be very hard to play. And I do love it, like you said, how the floor drops out there. When the violin comes in, all of the stuff that we've been raving over about this bass line, it's gone. It just disappears. And you really do float for a while. And then the violinist ends his phrase there, and then the bass re-enters. And then we have that stable material again. But then after a really short time, the violin comes back in, and then we float again.
Yeah, I mean, the longtime listeners of A Moment of Bach, hey, we're far enough into this now that we probably have people who have, listened the whole way, and then some who have just come on. But the longtime listeners will know that that's what I love. In those first, I think the first and third and fifth episode were all those were all my moments that I picked, and they all have to do with the bass line kind of just coming away, and then we float, we wait for the bass to drop back in, right? The bass drop, as they say.
Yeah.
And those moments are always really satisfying, whether it's in like EDM music of today or way back here. It's like you feel like you're floating for a second, and then at an opportune moment, it's like, boom, you get that foundation right back.
Yeah, and the reason why that works so well in all these very different styles of music is that those lower notes, those lower frequencies, act as a real grounding element, right? They feel like the firm earth in a way.
Yeah, and giving even a momentary pulling out of the rug from underneath your feet to make you lose your balance, but then suddenly it's like if somebody did that, right? They pulled out the rug, but then later they sort of pick you up and just set you back down. It's like, it's okay, I got you. That's the metaphor.
Exactly.
There, I think. I've noticed so often with my own arrangements and compositions. That's a thing that's like a trope that I maybe overuse. I'm always doing this thing where stuff is happening, everything is full, and then on the downbeat of a measure, I'll take the bass away, right? Mm-hmm. And I'll boom, hit it on beat 2 or whatever, Mm-hmm. So it's just 1, 2, and then on 2 it's like a big bass note. That kind of thing is really effective, and mm-hmm. you see it here. I mean, it's not on beat 2 here, but you see it just in every era of music, basically.
You do. It works with the drum set, with the kick drum, with the bass drum. It works. And in this era, the continuo bass. I mean, in English, it was called the ground bass. So yeah. It's the ground.
Well, and it's yeah. I mean, this idea is I just alluded to it a second ago, but this idea is huge in electronic music.
Mm-hmm.
That
for sure.
Not just electronic music now, but old, electronic music of the late 80s or especially 90s, where it's even then it was there was this big buildup, and the idea is that the bass is not in yet, or at least it's cut out for a long time, and it strings you along, and then at a really satisfying moment the bass drops, right? That's a huge thing in music of today, and it's kind of cool to me that it's definitely not new.
It's not new, but delightfully it actually was a lot newer in Bach's time.
It's true,
because the Baroque era, the thing that it brought to the table was the new firmness of the bass line.
That's true. Yeah, you've talked about that a lot.
Yeah. This is something that astounds me, and I remember thinking as a student learning this, that can't be right. But it is absolutely true that even though people did sing low and play low-sounding instruments hundreds and hundreds of years before Bach, it's still true that the idea of a firm and organized bass line that is the basis of harmony above it is something that doesn't actually get put into popular practice until after the year 1600.
Right.
And it's only been a couple of hundred years of development of the later Renaissance composers experimenting with lower things, and even for a long time before that, there was always a lower part, but the lower part had no functional difference to the parts above it, right? In any real way. Sometimes it was usually just as melodic as the others, and wasn't the root of chords or anything like that, really.
Right.
So I love thinking about that, and that how the many things that come from around the world to bring the global type of music that we have now with the drum set and the emphasis on rhythm, a lot of it doesn't come from the Western world, and
right.
And pop music uses very little of the narrative power of Western harmony, and stuff like that.
Yep.
And counterpoint. That stuff's not popular anymore, but what did really click with everyone in the world is the bass line.
Yeah.
And the bass line is omnipresent now. There's a bass line in everything you hear now, just about. Usually it's an electric bass or something like that, or, something synthesized. But it's there. There's a bass line in everything now.
Yeah. Would sound weird without it.
Yeah. It sounded like it was floating the whole time and not grounded.
Yeah. And now, here are Christian's 2 moments from the first 6 measures of the slow movement from the Concerto in A minor for violin, BWV 1041. If this introduction to a musical moment has inspired you to hear the rest of this piece, please see the link in the episode description to see the performance of BWV 1041 by the Netherlands Bach Society. Do you want to hear our new episodes as we release them? Find us on your podcast app and hit subscribe. Also check out our Facebook and Instagram, and we have a website, amomentofbach.com. Thank you to all our listeners. We know we can see that we have some listeners from the US and also some listeners internationally. Thank you for spreading the word about A Moment of Bach. And please always remember to reach out to us with suggestions or comments or anything like that. We love to hear that stuff.
Yeah. What are we talking about next time?
Next time we're talking about the motet Komm Jesu Komm, BWV 229.
Until next time, enjoy those moments.